Um, you mentioned a couple particular characters that Augustine either is engaging in directly or indirectly through a friend. You mentioned Boniface, further out, Marcellinus, who's a close colleague. There's another particular figure that comes up in City of God, and I wonder how that might add some texture and color to the way you're sketching his understanding of the use of authority. Early in City of God and the first 5 books, he talks about Theodosius as an example when he's dealing with the criticism that Christianity's bad for Rome. He makes a whole host of arguments to undercut that, but one of the arguments is, let's talk about what a good citizen and even a good emperor would be. And Theodosius is it. And Theodosius is it in spite of the fact that there are some violent and some rather heinous actions. How does Augustine's description of Theodosius, his use of authority and power, his use of violence, his response to being called out by Ambrose, how does his character fill out our understanding of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting passage. It's the end of book 5 of City of God, where Augustine treats Theodosius, who's the one who officially Christianizes the Roman Empire, establishes it as the state religion. And that's a really complicated passage, and it's controversial. Peter Brown famously described that as one of the shoddiest passages in all of City of God. He's actually, in personal conversation, taken back that judgment because there was this really long French article written about that passage, and he thought it wasn't as bad. I think that it's an interesting passage in a lot of ways in that what does Theodosius do? Well, what is he celebrated for? One of the things he's celebrated for is actually destroying pagan temples. Like Roman, it's actually acting against Roman religion in a way that I think in a liberal democratic context, you would sort of feel, worried about if, people just went around destroying churches or mosques or whatever, according to whatever religion they were. But he's celebrating that. The other big thing that he celebrates with Theodosius is that Theodosius is involved with this massacre in Thessaloniki, and Ambrose rebukes him and essentially excommunicates him and prevents him from participating in Eucharist. And then Theodosius repents. And Augustine says, this is truly amazing. And there's a sentence in this chapter, I think it's 526, where he says, Theodosius considered it a greater honor to be a member of the church than to be the ruler of the whole world. So what Augustine really likes there is that his identity, that Theodosius's identity is primarily as a Christian, and he is under the authority of the church more so than he lives into his identity as an emperor. I mean, the idea that a bishop would tell an emperor what to do, right? Think about the debates you sometimes have with a Catholic politician who might be democratic on abortion, right? And can a Catholic bishop discipline that politician? For Augustine, yeah, absolutely. The bishop is more important because of the Christian identity trumping. That was not all that. Sorry, I'm not trying to take political sides here, and that was not actually intended as a pun. But the Christian identity supersedes your political identity, and therefore Augustine can command political officials with regard to their spiritual lives, but that actually should have a political effect as well. Whether you want to agree with that or that aligns with modern understandings of separation of church and state, that's an interesting question. It's also a very weird historical moment because Ambrose is an aristocrat. He's not a normal bishop. He's from a very, very different political status. And so he's able to command around Theodosius in a way that a normal bishop wouldn't. But in principle, that's what Augustine says. And he thinks that an emperor should, if they're a Christian, be just as Christian in office as any other Christian. There's nothing about your being emperor that means that you don't repent of your sins and exercise humility.
One more question, maybe to get another element before us. You talked predominantly about various actions and how they may or may not be morally appropriate, given a certain authority and so forth, a certain office, ways in which people thought about that. Augustine's also offering throughout City of God and other texts what we call a psychology, a moral psychology about the agent, about what's going on in the inner life. And a phrase that he introduces on the very first page that appears throughout is this notion of libido dominandi, the lust to dominate that becomes a dominating lust. How does that help add another texture or layer to what you're exploring here?
Yeah, and this will maybe get back to your earlier question as well about Theodosius. Augustine associates domination with the earthly city. The lust for domination is dominated, or sorry, the earthly city is dominated by its own lust for domination. And so you see that in the history of all the Roman wars. And the entire history of the earthly city for Augustine is defined by empire, primarily by Assyria, Babylon in the east, and by Rome in the west. You see that in 512. He really narrates the whole history of humanity. And the reason is that you essentially begin with pride and self-love. And you begin with prioritizing earthly goods over heavenly goods. And then the way that you get those things, how do you get more earthly things to satisfy yourself as opposed to worshiping God? Two things especially, violence and idolatry. Idolatry, you create a bunch of gods that get you stuff. So if you want a good harvest, you create a god for corn. Actually, you create 3 gods for corn, as Augustine says in book 4. So idolatry is a reflection of a lust for earthly goods, a way to get more and more stuff. Violence is the same thing. You take over more and more territories because then you get more and more earthly stuff. And so the whole history of the earthly city will naturally tend toward empire with both Assyria and with Rome. Where does that all begin? It begins with a pride inside the heart, right? So City of God is, I think, sort of like Confessions on an imperial scale, right? If Confessions is a story of loves in the life of an individual, City of God is what love looks like properly or improperly formed at the imperial level, at the level of society and politics and so forth. So what does it look like collectively if everybody loves himself more than God, if everybody loves earthly things more than heavenly city, more than heavenly rewards? It looks like a lot of violence, a lot of false religion and ideologies. It looks like a lot of sexual immorality. It looks like the frivolity of the theater and the circus and the games and things like that. It looks like people frittering away everything that they do and just indulging carnal pleasures while they're super violent, super greedy, super luxurious. They oppress the poor. They want prostitutes on demand. Look at City of God 220 and see if you need any translation between 5th century North Africa and the contemporary context. So for Augustine, the great social evils in the world begin with the sins of the personal heart. And the thing that I think is really interesting about Augustine, this gets back to the Theodosius thing. What Augustine likes about Theodosius is, mostly that he humbles himself and repents before Ambrose. But he also celebrates that he's destroying these Roman idols and so forth. And this aligns with Augustine's position on coercion. And I have a problem with this because it looks like what Augustine comes to support is the domination by the church of other people. It becomes Christian domination. And it leads to this whole history of imperialism and colonialism and so forth. And so there's a sort of tension in Augustine where on the one hand, he associates domination with the earthly city. On the other hand, he supports practices where it seems like Christians are dominating others. And I think that is a complexity of reading Augustine and appropriating him because he's operating in a post-Constantinian context where he's actually pretty happy you have a lot of Christian emperors. And on the one hand, he says Christians are like exiles, like David in Babylon, who's always in a precarious situation. You live as outsiders to this unjust society. On the other hand, he's pretty cozy with a lot of high imperial officials and wants to use them to do the church's purposes. I think there's a certain trajectory that you can trace out into the medieval period with the conflation of church and state, of imperial and ecclesial powers that is like really difficult to untangle in Augustine. I think there's a tension in his thought. And the way I go is I go with his theology of the 2 cities, the church as a pilgrim people, because I think that's biblical. I think that actually makes biblical and theological sense. The way that he colludes with empire seems to me more a function of his status as a Roman and where the church is at that juncture in society.
Yeah, he's thinking through an issue at a time of transition where suddenly Christians do have access to power and the opportunity to do that. I wonder if in similar fashion, we could flip over to Luther and let me make you work for a minute.
I don't know Luther as well.
That's why I'm picking on that. So you were talking about how Luther's description of a person doing something as a human versus a person doing something as a Christian. Luther's in another time of transition, and after a long period of that medieval Christianization of Europe, is he assuming a lot that Augustine isn't and can't about how people are formed, about what virtues, what character, what identity they're going to bring, such that perhaps he can speak in ways that aren't as overtly or sort of prioritizing Christian identity, precisely because he assumes that over the course of the medieval period, whereas Augustine maybe has to emphasize that because they're getting used to being a dominant religious power. Does that complicate things or not?
I mean, I'm sympathetic to that reading. The thing that's complicated about Augustine is that on the one hand, he describes the church as this pilgrim people, as exiles in Babylon. On the other hand, he lives in the equivalent of the Bible Belt. That's why he talks about the wheat and the tares all the time. And that's why if you read his stuff on catechesis, he's constantly worried about false conversions. Like the beginning of his instructions for beginners in the faith all starts with, explore their motivations, see if they're trying to become a Christian for earthly reward, see if they're trying to get, a political office, and that's why they're seeking baptism. So that's why he's so big on the wheat and the tares. The tares are going to be mixed in with the wheat because he's looking around and everybody's at church because it's a social thing to do, except when the circus is in town, the Super Bowl, right? And then like nobody's at church and he gets really angry. And those are pretty much the people he thinks are tares, even though he shouldn't quite think that because he also thinks you can't see into the soul. So there may be, obviously there's different historical contexts, but this is something I've wrestled with Augustine in that he is living in a pretty Christianized empire. And so his theology doesn't quite line up with, it's not the case that, Christianity is just a minority religion at this point. It's actually dominant. So
we've got time for other questions. If you want to raise your hand, Matt.
So how would that kind of relate to this idea of the idol smashing and seeing it as a good thing? Because I wrote this note earlier, the best thing others they would enter into trying to balance that with respecting them as those tensions.
I'm told I'm to repeat questions. So the question is, how does Augustine's practice and encouragement of the smashing of pagan religious sites, how is that a good and seeking out the good of others? And how might that relate to how we might think about respecting others in the civic sphere?
Yeah, so Augustine's operating in a context so different from ours, where religion and politics are just so blended together. So this is an Enlightenment thing, a modern liberal development for us to think that these things should be separated, right? So Augustine, even though I've stressed a lot how he defends coercion and he's the first great theorist of religious coercion, everybody was doing it. He just explained why. So it was sort of like this normal thing that was already happening. It wasn't as radical for us to think about. He thinks it's a great thing to destroy idols because then they won't worship demons. Right? Then the people won't worship demons. They can turn instead to Jesus Christ. And he consistently, when he talks about the liberation of Jesus Christ from domination, he's talking about essentially the incarnation and the destruction of temples. In our context, that's really hard to think about because we so value religious liberty. We think about religion more as sort of a personal faith or set of beliefs as opposed to even practices, right? It's things that are more visible in the social sphere. But the reality is that we, coerce people all the time in our political system. It's a sort of a normal thing that society needs to operate in certain ways. The integration of schools in the 1950s, that was coerced with federal troops, right? We just don't coerce about religion, but we will coerce about certain other things, other social and political issues, which were which we think are really important and which we feel like it's important to get people in the right place. And it's an interesting thing to ask, to what extent do certain government policies and coercive practices and so forth, in fact, shape the way that people think about things, right? Some of the laws and policies established in the 1960s mean that we just talk about race really differently than we did in the 1940s. Like certain things that were taken for granted during the time of Jim Crow aren't the same. And so, that's not to say that we don't still have issues with race, but it's to say that policies and practices shaped public discourse about these things, and arguably that might have shaped also internal attitudes.
Tyler, you had a question?
Obviously, there are people who actually like us. I wonder if you could perhaps compare and contrast Dustin's social vision with theirs, perhaps more where we may not be actually.
All right, Tyler told me earlier to repeat questions. So Tyler's question, I think, reduces to, was Augustine the homeboy of the neo-Calvinists, the Kuypers and Bavinks? Is there continuity there, or is something surprisingly different happening so far as you want to talk about that movement?
Okay, so I'm not totally familiar with how precisely neo-Calvinists are appropriating Augustine. I can tell you what I think Augustine says, and
Bravely go there.
I think it may, where it may differ in certain ways. I should say that even though I presented an assertive reading of Augustine, I think Augustine's really hard to interpret, and there are tensions in his thought, and you could appropriate him in a lot of different ways. So I don't think there's only one way to appropriate him. I think it's almost a mistake to think that there is, because our social context is so different from his time, including, say, on the issues that we talked about destroying Roman temples and so forth. The side of Augustine that I prioritize when I'm reading him is his theology of the two cities, where the Israelites are like exiles in Babylon. And they promote the peace of the city because in its peace is your peace. And what that means to me is, one, because of the humility of the heavenly city and the fact that we don't pursue temporal goods as ends in and of themselves, the status of Christians in society, in all post-lapsarian society, is always going to be on the margins and in the situation of persecution, right? So his classic example is City of God 15 with Cain and Abel. That's like your picture of the domination of Cain and the earthly city over against the persecution of Abel, who's essentially a martyr, right? So martyrdom is sort of like the final form of Christian witness, like with Jesus, like with the apostles and so forth. So we don't naturally expect to have positions of power in society because we're Christians who live by different values that will get persecuted, and because we don't pursue earthly goods in the same way that the earthly city does. So we're always going to get taken advantage of. We're always going to get run over. And that's just what it means to be a Christian. On the other hand, we need temporal peace in order to survive in this world. As the Israelites live in Babylon, it's a good thing if Babylon is politically stable. Like, we might not think much about our political leaders, but it is a helpful thing if they get along for our sake, because if they screw up the whole thing, it's going to screw things up for us too. So we actually have a strong interest in making sure the surrounding society is, stable, secure, flourishing in material ways, because otherwise we're not going to survive. That's sort of the language that Augustine uses, I think, when he's appropriating Jeremiah 29. So I don't think that's like spheres of sovereignty. I don't think that's sort of like Christians just entering into all these spheres or doing top-down cultural change or something like this. But it is to say that we want to promote the well-being of society around us, because we also need those supports as well. So for me, I live in a low-income African-American community that has really high rates of incarceration, crime, poverty, unemployment, under-resourced schools, and so forth. If the city of Chicago is going through a major debt crisis, if there's an employment problem in Chicago, that's going to be the worst in my community. If crime goes up in Chicago, that's always in my neighborhood that the shootings and the murders and so forth increase. It is for the good of my neighborhood that the whole city of Chicago flourish, whether or not the mayor or other city officials are Christian. I just want them to do a good job and create a flourishing city so that our particular neighborhood isn't always, getting the bottom end of the barrel. And that's, I think, the way that you can draw on Augustine to see there's a way in which you acknowledge marginality as the way that Christians are going to operate in this world because we don't fight for the same things in the same way, and because we live according to values that are out of line with the earthly city. And there's ways in which we can promote the broader goods of society, but that's not in the same way as leavening all of society with our presence in all these different spheres, or adopting a more, I don't know, like almost trying to infuse Christianity everywhere. We're trying to make things less bad so that we can survive.
Let me follow up and ask a second question, not about where you live and the neighborhood, but where you work and how this might flavor vocational thought. So you don't teach in a seminary where you're training pastors and other ministry workers predominantly. You're in a college setting, and it's a Christian college where Bible and theology are taught and worship happens, but it's a liberal arts setting where biology is studied and economics and a host of other disciplines. So putting your Augustinian cap on, how does that shape how you think mainly about teaching those other disciplines, not just you, but colleagues?
So how does my reading of Augustine's Theology of the Cities help me to think about my students' formation?
In particular, what you're talking about there, the value of society flourishing, even if it's the city of man, right?
Yeah, so I have really, really wonderful students, as you're probably aware. And it is really one of the best parts about my job that I get to do theology in a liberal arts context where I'm surrounded by people of different disciplines. And I have students who are going to go on to do a lot of different things. A lot of them do go on to seminary, but they're not sort of the default student necessarily. The way I try to form my students is, this is the whole college, is to help them to think about whatever kind of work they might do from a faith perspective. So what does it mean to be a Christian and a doctor? What does it mean to be a Christian and a lawyer? How do I integrate faith and learning in a way that will also be vocational? But we also challenge this notion that the only way that you can, do God's work in the world is to be like the top lawyer or the top CEO, to like be the Christian who is like in the upper realms of society and influencing things from there. I try to push my students to look at ways in which you can promote flourishing amongst under-resourced communities. So for instance, we have this senior seminar at Wheaton for Bible and Theology called Faith, Work, and Flourishing. And it's designed around visits to the city of Chicago. And we go to under-resourced communities. One is African-American, one's Latino, one's Chinatown. And you start to see all the complex needs of each of the communities, and they're all really different. In the African-American community, a lot of it is about law enforcement, about violence and so forth. In Little Village, there's all these sort of new immigration concerns. In Chinatown, a lot of it's language development. There's also casino issues. It's not like one thing that you can predict, like all Chinatowns have issues with casinos. It just happens to be that this particular Chinatown, there's an issue with these casinos showing up and having these buses take people all over the place. And what you discover is that every community needs people of lots of different gifts contributing. Every community needs people who are civically engaged, who can provide medicine, who can provide medical, provide for medical needs or mental health support or disability support, or it might be like immigration support or legal support or whatever. And you don't have to be, at the very best place in society, at the biggest firms, at the biggest companies, in order to do that well. There's actually a lot of need for privileged people to take their gifts into places where there aren't as many resources and promote those communities from the grassroots. So I think you can integrate faith with lots of different spheres, but it doesn't have to lend itself to a kind of elitism.